This session's going to flow nicely from the morning session. We're going to explore the latest research on the connections between climate change and mental health, including recent research findings from Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And we hope you learn more about how climate change is shaping mental health and what this research teaches us about effectively responding to the climate emergency. And we will have some opportunity for you to ask the questions in the room and on Menti again. So I'm going to join our panelists here. For a second. Am I on now? Yes, I am. Okay, great. Okay, so we are very pleased to have this panel with us today. Dr. Sherry Lee Harper with the School of Public Health at the University of Alberta is a Canada Research Chair in Climate Change and Health and a professor at the School of Public Health at the U of A. Her research investigates health equity in the context of climate change, and she collaborates with partners across sectors to prioritize climate-related health actions, planning, interventions, and research. She was a lead author on 2 intergovernmental panel on climate change reports, served on the Gender Task Group for the IPCC, lead author on Health Canada's 2022 Climate Change and Health Assessment, and co-chaired the Government of Canada's Health and Wellbeing Advisory Table for the National Adaptation Strategy. She is currently an IPCC Vice Chair. Welcome, Dr. Sherry Lee Harper. Thank you. And our second panelist is Stephanie Olson, who has a Master of Arts in Community Engagement, and she's also with the School of Public Health. Stephanie is under the supervision of Dr. Sherry Harper and Dr. Ashley Consuelo. Stephanie's research investigates the mental health impacts of climate change in Alberta and the power of collective spaces for honoring ecological grief and other difficult climate emotions. Stephanie is also a facilitator with Refugia, an Alberta organization that provides workshops and retreats on ecological grief, eco-anxiety, and the emotional impacts of living during times of planetary crisis. Welcome, Stephanie. And some of you who were here yesterday will have met Hannah Bain, but let's introduce her again. Hannah is an MSc epidemiology student with the Climate Change and Global Health Research Group at the U of A. She's the daughter of an ecologist and a psychologist and has always been passionate about climate change and mental health. She completed her BSc in 2023 with a psychology major and a music minor, and is now combining these passions with her interest in public health for her MSc research under the supervision of Sherry Lee Harper and Ashley Consuelo. Her research focuses on using music as an adaptation strategy, specifically focusing on using collective music making to cope with climate grief and anxiety. Hannah's very active in climate change communication and outreach and was awarded the NCPH Knowledge Translation Graduate Student Award for her work. Outside of her studies, Hannah enjoys volunteering with Girl Guides of Canada, organizing with Climate Justice Edmonton, spending time outdoors, playing the flute and piano, and reading novels. Welcome again, Hannah. So what we're going to do is our panelists have a great presentation for you, and we hope that you go ahead and take some notes. Well, there'll be a couple Mentimeter questions during the presentation, and then we will have time at the end for questions and a couple discussion questions.
Thank you so much, Kara. Tanse, everyone. Today we are gathered in Amiskwichi, Waskagan, which is situated in Treaty 6 territory and Métis Nation Region 4, land stewarded since time immemorial by Nehia, Denisuline, Nakota Sioux, Anishinaabe, Niitsitapi, Inuit, Métis, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures are foundational to our vibrant community. This is the land where Dr. Harper, Stephanie, and I live our lives, and we are so grateful for this land that has nurtured and protected us. We also want to extend our gratitude to the Inuit rights holders of Nunavut and Nunatsiavut, who are long-term partners with the Climate Change and Global Health Research Group. We are mindful of our interconnected relationship with Mother Earth, especially in the work that we do on climate change and mental health. We are all relations and have obligations to respect this land that has nourished and embraced us. We are grateful to the Indigenous peoples who are stewards of this land, and we must work together to move forward in a good way, especially as we address the climate change and its equitable health impacts. Many of us today are uninvited guests on this land, and so I urge all settlers to consider our obligations to the land and to its people. Ensure that you know and act on the 94 calls to action from the Committee for Truth and Reconciliation, as well as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Consider how you are engaging in anti-colonial work, including Indigenous knowledges in your lives and disrupting the power systems that uphold the invisibilization and discrimination against Indigenous peoples. Kinanaskamatin Allah.
Okay, so yeah, we just wanted to, well, first of all, thank you, Hannah, for that beautiful land acknowledgement. And we just wanted to give a really quick overview of the session. So we're going to start with a couple of mentee questions that will help us get to know the audience and how long you've all been thinking about mental health and climate change. And mentee will be used throughout the session. Then we're going to have a panel discussion where myself, Hannah, and Dr. Harper will outline some of the latest research on climate change and mental health in the prairie provinces. And there'll be a chance for questions and answers after. And then lastly, if there's time, there may be a small group discussion for folks to discuss some questions at their table or in a Zoom room. I think that might depend on time. But we'll get started with the mentee questions. So the first one is, how long have you been thinking about the connection between climate change and mental health? Yeah, and that's pretty amazing to see the collective expertise on this topic that's already in the room. Lots of folks have been thinking about this for over 10 years. And even I would say this is a topic that's gaining more traction in the mainstream. But it's something that people have been living with, especially communities on the front lines of climate change for a long time. And now is a really critical time to be investing in support for mental health, as we see that this is a widely experienced phenomenon and something we expect to grow. So the next mentee question is, has your organization provided supports or resources to address emotions associated with climate change? Yeah, and that's also really fascinating to see. The majority, majority of responses indicate that no, that's not necessarily on the minds of the organizations they work for. And for some, that's starting to be something that's offered. And then we have some where that seems to be, they seem to be well-resourced already. So yeah, we know that a huge number of people in Canada and in the prairies are experiencing mental health and emotional impacts from climate change. And this is especially true for people who work in this field. So yeah, really thinking about how our organizations can provide those resources and support is really important. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Harper now, who's going to start off our panel discussion.
Oh, perfect. Oh, look at that. Okay. It's such a pleasure to be here today. I'm really looking forward to this session. Thank you so much for setting the stage for us. Thanks for participating in the Mentee to give us a sense of how people have been thinking about climate change and mental health. So, climate change is increasingly covered in the news. Oftentimes when we talk about climate change or when we read about climate change, we're reading about it or talking about it as an environmental problem, or as a problem for infrastructure, or a problem for wildlife, or a problem for our economy. But today on our panel, we're really talking about how climate change impacts our health. We're, of course, specifically focusing on mental health, but there's a lot of power in thinking about climate change from a health lens. In fact, in the United States, there's some excellent research showing that if we frame climate change as a health issue, it's more effective at inspiring action compared to framing climate change as an environmental problem or as an economic problem or even as a national security problem, which is, of course, very, very important for a lot of Americans. So framing climate change as a health problem and also part of the solution can be really helpful. So I'm also up here today presenting with my intergovernmental panel on climate change hat on as one of the vice chairs and also one of the lead authors on 2 of their past recent reports. And as we have heard from many presentations so far, we know that climate change has already been impacting us. We know that things are going to get worse. And we know that it's impacted the lives of billions of people from around the world. And those are some of the key findings from our report. In the report, we also assessed how climate change has already impacted the health of millions of people from around the world. And it's impacted health in a variety of different ways. You know, it impacts our physical health, during wildfires, exposure to wildfire smoke, impacts lung health. Increasing temperatures can increase the risk of foodborne and waterborne disease. We've seen in Eastern Canada, especially increased risk of things like vector-borne diseases like Lyme disease and West Nile. It impacts just about every facet of our health. And touching all of these different impacts of health and in all the ways that climate change impacts our lives, it also impacts our mental health. And for the first time in IPCC history, we assessed how climate change was impacting mental health around the world. And we assessed how it impacts mental health through 3 different pathways. So the first pathway that we explored was mental health risks from extreme weather and extreme climate events. So things like wildfires or floods or droughts and how mental health is associated with those different extreme events. The other pathway that we explored was more slow onset events. So things like sea level rise, ocean acidification, gradual warming temperatures, all of these things impact mental health and are associated with things like solastalgia or ecological grief and mourning. But we also looked at how climate change impacts mental health, even if you haven't been directly impacted by climate change yourself. So maybe you haven't been evacuated from a community due to wildfires or experienced drought firsthand or seen landscape change because of permafrost thaw. Climate change can still impact your mental health, and that can be through vicarious experiences. So for example, seeing friends and family go through these experiences, scrolling through your social media feed, looking at the devastation that climate change is causing, or even being in a room like we are today, learning about climate change. These things can all impact our emotional wellness. But in our report, we also talked about the different options or the things that we can do to respond to some of these impacts in terms of adaptation. And today on our panel, our goal is to cover each one of those pathways through which climate change impacts mental health, but also what are our response options? What can we do to reduce some of these impacts? So I'm delighted to turn the floor over to Hannah, who will walk us through that first pathway of extreme climate change events impacts on mental health.
Well, hi everyone. I am so excited to be here. So today I am going to be looking at the direct impacts of climate change on mental health by looking at a case study of the Fort McMurray wildfires in 2016. Dr. Morrison mentioned yesterday that these have been attributed to climate change. So that is just an important stage setting for this. So to give context for anyone not from Alberta or who has not heard about these before, this was an event in May 2016. Over 90,000 people were evacuated from the Fort McMurray area. To give some context, only about 66,000 people actually lived in Fort McMurray at the time of the fires. So surrounding nearby First Nations were evacuated, as well as oil and gas rigs. This was the costliest disaster in Canadian history. Over 2,400 structures were destroyed, and it was an incredibly stressful experience for everyone involved. Evacuees went to Lac La Biche, a nearby smaller community, but also down to Edmonton and even as far as Calgary. And you can see that it was quite a drive. People were evacuated for up to 6 weeks, living in hotels, in apartments with family and friends, and sometimes even with strangers. There's only one highway out of the city, so escaping from these fires was a really stressful experience for a lot of people. And because of some like communication pathway breakdowns, there was a lot of people trying to get out as flames were engulfing the highway. The fires actually took over a year to put out completely, but people were able to return starting in June. So let's talk short-term impacts. So in the 3 months after the event, we can see really elevated levels of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. Especially with this context of this PTSD number, when you look at a general cross-sectional look at Canadians, about 5% of people at any time report experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. So 30% or almost 30% is an incredibly high number. Mental health care ended at about around the end of July, August, even when the fire started in May. So we're seeing that even at this 3-month point where there was very elevated levels of these issues, people were not receiving the support they needed. And 1 year after, 1 in 3 people was experiencing some sort of impact, mental health impact from the wildfires. Looking to medium-term impacts, we see the numbers have dropped, but they are still elevated. So compared to a pre-wildfire survey, PTSD is up 13.6%. In the sample they had, nobody reported having PTSD. Depression was at 15.2% before, and anxiety at 14.5%. So there is a decrease in this medium term, but not back to pre-disaster levels. But this is a different story for young people. So at 1.5 years post-wildfire, 46% of high schoolers, so 1 in 2, basically met the criteria for either PTSD, anxiety, depression, or substance use disorder. And this actually increased at the 3.5-year mark. So a lot of people expected this to go down. As time went on, people are going to experience less impacts, but that's not true. And this is a statistically significant difference. So let's go to these long-term impacts. One study found that they kind of about 37.4% of people had low resilience. Resilience was measured by the ability to adapt positively and to overcome adversity. So these were people who were not able to do that in the face of disaster. This was predicted by experiencing PTSD at any point post-wildfire. This means that people are less resilient to future and compounding disasters. And Fort McMurray experienced a lot of them. And this impacted people's ability to cope. So they had, in 2020, Fort McMurray experienced both the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, as did the entire world, but they also experienced a very severe flood. And for those who experienced two, so COVID and the wildfire or the flood, there was 10 times the odds of having PTSD and 11 times the odds of anxiety. For people who experienced all three, this lower resilience and the impacts of the wildfire were really seen in an 18 times the odds of having anxiety compared to someone who had experienced only one of these impacts, so just COVID. There were mental health supports offered post-pandemic, but as I did say, they end up leaving the community pretty quickly, especially the ones offered by provincial governments. They often don't make it past this like honeymoon phase that people talk about in disaster response, where people are feeling really good. They got to come back to their community. They're forming these connections, but then they don't last into that medium and long term where we're still seeing those impacts. There are barriers to mental health care. These are just some. This one study identified that there are both motivational and structural barriers. Stigma, pessimism, not knowing if it's going to help, and a desire for self-resilience are some of these motivational barriers. But there are structural barriers, people not receiving information, it being financially inaccessible, and even non-response. People will reach out, ask for mental health support, and not get anything back. Many groups are disproportionately impacted, especially we see overlap with general equity deserving groups and other people impacted by the climate crisis, not just in direct ways. But there are ways to have a better response. So responses that are useful need to be sustained. So they need to go beyond the initial impact. They need to be in that community for years. As we saw at 5 years post-disaster, people were still experiencing mental health impacts. They also need to be local because they can't be sustained if they're not local. They need to be able to be done in community by members of that community. They also need to be interdisciplinary. Individual psychotherapy is incredibly important. Medications are incredibly important pieces of the mental health puzzle, but community-focused healing, art nights, collective yoga, understanding like meditation practices, all of these proved to be very useful for when they got piloted post-disaster. They also need to be equity-focused. As we saw, not everyone experiences these mental health impacts the same, and we need to understand who's being the most impacted so we can have targeted and specific healing practices that can help those people. I am now going to pass it over to Dr. Harper, who is going to talk about emotional responses to climate change in the prairies.
Okay, so that was an example of people's experiences after climate extreme. But now I'm going to talk about how we just generally feel about climate change. So this isn't necessarily like clinical presentations of different mental health outcomes. It's just how do we feel about climate change? People have already shared how they feel about climate change on various panels so far. So following along that line of how do we feel about climate change? So in this work, I often get asked the question when we present on these types of findings, we often get asked by policymakers, by decision makers, by the general public, and especially by people who are a little bit skeptical about climate change. They might say, yes, that makes sense. Obviously, that's a very stressful situation. Yes, we know that some people feel very strongly and have strong emotional responses about climate change or climate change anxiety, but how common is it? Like, in Canada, do we really need to be concerned about this? Like, is that only a few people, or like, how big of a problem is this? So what we did is we designed a national survey to actually ask this question. How do people in Canada, how do Canadians feel about climate change? How is climate change impacting their mental health? So we did this huge study. This is the first time that we're sharing some of the results. So this is like, preliminary results, but also hot off the press, first shared with you. It was a huge survey conducted across Canada in multiple languages. Over 2,500 people participated in the survey. It was random, so that means that this should be representative of the Canadian population. So what did we find? We found lots of different things, but I wanted to share 5 things that stood out with me to me. The first is that people are feeling concerned. So each of these little bars are different provinces. And I've highlighted with the red boxes, the prairie provinces. And so you can see that the prairie provinces are closer to the end of the graph, which means that generally they reported less concern than other provinces, but it's pretty high across the board. So pretty much most Canadians are pretty concerned about climate change. Same thing with climate change, being worried about climate change. Again, the prairie provinces were closer to the end, but really the large majority of people in the prairies and in Canada are very worried about climate change. So first finding, people are concerned and worried about climate change. Most people are. Maybe that's not so surprising. We also looked at things like emotions like grief and sadness. So do you experience sadness or grief when you think about climate change? And again, you can see that the prairie provinces tend to be a little bit more at the end, but still the large majority of people are experiencing some level of grief or sadness when it comes to climate change. So the third thing that I wanted to touch on was climate change anxiety. So clinical psychologists have come up with this scale to measure climate change anxiety. So climate change anxiety is multiple feelings and emotions that come together that can impact our cognitive ability or can also lead to functional impairment. So it like actually leads to things like crying or sadness or nightmares or things like that. So we applied this climate change anxiety scale to Canadians to look at how these different emotions are manifesting in the form of climate change anxiety and how it's impacting cognitive ability as well as functional impairment. So this graph is pretty messy, but it shows the results. But this is the take home of the result. Basically, lots of Canadians are experiencing climate change anxiety, and the prairie regions are experiencing it significantly more than Ontario or than the Atlantic region. But we did see the highest levels of climate change anxiety in the Canadian North, which makes sense because, as we learned yesterday, Arctic Canada is one of the fastest warming places on the planet. Oops, wrong way. So lots of Canadians are experiencing climate change anxiety, and the prairie region is experiencing higher levels of climate change anxiety than some other regions in Canada. We also looked at other emotions like anger. We heard a little bit about this yesterday. People are feeling angry about climate change. Again, we found that Saskatchewan and Alberta were near the end. Manitoba actually ranked third highest in the country. But again, across the board, we're seeing generally high levels of anger associated with climate change. We also saw high levels of people reporting hopelessness, helplessness, and powerlessness across the board related to climate change. So feeling like helpless or hopeless, or that there's nothing really that they can do in response to climate change. We also looked at how some of these emotions are linked to action. So we also asked people what individual and what collective actions they may or may not be taking related to climate change. So we asked whether people were participating in climate marches or contacting their local politicians about climate change. So more collective actions, as well as individual actions. So things like being conscious of your carbon footprint, or like turning out the lights, or doing individual actions related to climate change. We asked about diet as well. And we found that people who reported higher levels of climate change emotions also reported higher levels of individual and collective action. So we're not quite sure what to make out from this finding, because this could mean that if you're doing all these actions, so you're participating in marches, you're taking individual actions, it's actually not making people feel better. So we didn't see that lowered people's climate change emotions. And this is sort of counter to a lot of discourse that we hear, is that, well, if you're feeling climate change anxiety, just go ahead and do something about it, be proactive. And of course, that I'm not dismissing that, because that is really helpful for some people, but we didn't necessarily see that at the Canadian level. However, it could also mean that people are feeling these strong climate change emotions, and that's leading them to take action. So if you're really angry about something, or if you're really upset about something or concerned or worried, that could be driving people to go out and march. So we're not quite sure what to make of this result because of the way the study was designed, but it definitely doesn't indicate that taking these actions are making people feel better. So that's the fourth main finding. And then the fifth thing I wanted to share is that these climate change emotions are not evenly distributed. So just like Hannah presented from the Fort McMurray wildfires, it's the same thing across Canada. So we know that greater levels of climate change emotions and climate change anxiety, they were higher for younger people. So as people got older, the emotions sort of declined. So there was youth were experiencing significantly more climate change related emotions than older adults. We also found that cisgender women and non-binary people were reporting higher levels of climate change anxiety and climate change related emotions than cisgender men. We found that Indigenous peoples were reporting significantly higher levels of climate change anxiety than non-Indigenous people. Interestingly, people in urban city centers in the prairies were reporting higher levels of climate change and emotions than people in rural areas. And then the other thing that we also measured was if you've experienced a climate change impact like the Fort McMurray wildfires, those people who had experienced direct impacts of climate change, or who had friends or family or knew someone who had been through something like that, also reported significantly higher levels of different climate change related emotions. And these results on this slide are specific to the prairies. They're not generalized for Canada overall. This is specific to the prairies. So those are the 5 key takeaways. But I also want to highlight that these climate change related emotions are normal. It's normal to feel angry and frustrated about climate change. It's normal to feel loss, and it's normal to feel grief about some of these things that are happening. These are all natural, normal human responses to environmental destruction. So I think that there can be danger in pathologizing some of these things or making people feel like feeling these climate change related emotions are not normal or unusual, because as I presented, most Canadians are feeling that way. And we did publish a research paper talking about that, talking about how these emotional responses to climate change are perfectly normal emotions, and we shouldn't be talking about them as something that people should be feeling bad about or nervous about discussing. These are normal emotions that are pretty common in Canada. So now I'm happy to turn it over to Steph, who's going to walk us through one of those emotions in a little bit more detail, and that's ecological grief.
Thank you, Dr. Harper. Thanks. Yeah, so I'm Steph, and I'm going to talk today about my master's research on ecological grief. So for this research, I partnered with a community organization called Refugee Retreats, and I conducted a qualitative study with people living in Alberta who had accessed programs for addressing ecological grief and other difficult climate emotions. So the study investigates the emotional impacts of the climate crisis and what helped participants cope with those impacts. So whereas the study Dr. Harper is talking about is sort of high-level quantitative, this puts sort of some narrative and lived experience to what people are going through. Great. So ecological grief is a wide range of emotional responses to ecological loss and destabilization, and all of its implications for our lives and communities. So that includes grief for losses to the natural world, loss of species, ecosystems, waterways, concern for the suffering of plants and animals. And ecological grief also includes personal, social, cultural, and political losses that ripple out from ecological destabilization. So that could be loss of health, loss of hopes and dreams for the future, whether that's our own future or that of our loved ones, grappling with what it means to have kids, with what it means to parent at this time in human history, loss of land-based identities and knowledge, loss of faith in our political systems. So sometimes ecological grief arises in response to total losses, like losing a place to a wildfire or flood or natural disaster. And often it accompanies incremental, slow, chronic loss. So one example of chronic loss that came up very strongly in my research was noticing that summer in Alberta is no longer this time of ease and carefreeness. You can't just go for a bike ride. You can't just plan a camping trip because we're increasingly navigating poor air quality, extreme heat, wildfires. And as a place where our winters are so long and dark and isolating, losing that really precious season of ease is honestly quite devastating. So the takeaway here is that people experience ecological grief in really intimate and direct ways. It's not abstract. It's actually woven into many people's emotional experience of what it's like to be alive right now during this time of planetary crisis. I also want to clarify that ecological grief is not a single note emotion. It's not just sadness, for example. Grief is a complex emotion that has lots of different expressions. So it includes sadness, anger, guilt, anxiety, longing, also love, also numbness. So lots of those emotions that Sherry was talking about, or Dr. Harper was talking about. And just before I get into my research, I wanted to go over some of what the literature tells us about ecological grief so far. So first of all, ecological grief is something that a lot of people experience, as Dr. Harper highlighted. And I've spoken with many people who feel very alone in their emotional response to the climate crisis, especially in Alberta. And if that's the case for anyone here, I just want to assure you that you are in good company. We also know that ecological grief is not a psychological disorder. So it's not pathological, it's not being too sensitive or overreacting. It's actually an adaptive and wise response that comes from our attachment and care to a world that's increasingly endangered by some humans and some human systems. And ecological grief is actually an expression of that care and attachment. So grief research has long argued that grief is the price we pay for love. And ecological grief may hold a lot of wisdom about what it is we care about, what's at stake, and what is worth fighting for. Lastly, ecological grief is considered a disenfranchised form of grief. So disenfranchised grief describes losses that are not validated as real and impactful by the dominant culture. And as a result, people don't have scripts and rituals and community support for moving through that loss. So for example, if your favorite camping spot burns in a wildfire or a place that is beloved to you, you don't get time off work and there's not predetermined rituals for how to honor what that place meant to you. And ecological grief, it's also not the only form of disenfranchised grief. You could think of losing a pet, getting a divorce, terminating a pregnancy. All of these are examples of impactful losses that we don't have mainstream practices for honoring. So one really important question then, when it comes to supporting people's experience of ecological grief, is how do we enfranchise ecological loss and all of its impacts? And that's the question that my research attempts to shed light on. So I'm going to share some preliminary results. But first, I want to clarify that this research focused on the experiences of people who participated in formal programs around ecological grief. And that means that they voluntarily sought out those spaces and the space was well facilitated. So this might not be true. These findings might not transfer in cases where those things aren't true. But across the board, people talked about how powerful it was to participate in spaces that welcomed emotional honesty about the climate crisis. Lots of people felt very alone in their experience, had received stigmatizing messages about being too sensitive, or that, messages that their emotions weren't welcome. So being witnessed and witnessing others in that emotional experience without anyone trying to fix it, minimize it, suggest anything was really, really powerful. Another valuable exercise was rituals for honoring ecological loss. And these were sometimes private rituals or sometimes group rituals. And they really helped participants express, honor, and transform those heavy, stuck feelings. And most people left the rituals feeling emotionally lighter and freer. And the last resilience practice that I'm going to bring up is building intentional relationships with the natural world. And that intentionality piece was really key. It wasn't just being outside. The most valuable practices involved slowing down, careful observation, getting to know a particular place or species, thinking about reciprocity with the natural world, or engaging in contemplative or meditative practices with the natural world. And I just also wanted to share some of the impacts that these practices had on participants' well-being and capacity for climate action. So first of all, having a non-judgmental space to honestly share and metabolize their emotions about the climate crisis alleviated loneliness and stigma. And participants felt a stronger sense of community, which actually made them feel a lot more hopeful about our capacity to collectively tackle the climate crisis, because it is not an individual problem. Sharing their honest emotions about the climate crisis also transformed some of the most difficult and burdensome feelings. So many participants described these practices as cathartic, something that made them feel lighter. And participants also noted that when they tried to numb or ignore their negative emotions, like ecological grief, they also lost access to some of their positive emotions, like wonder and awe and joy. So attending to that grief also helped them be present to positive emotions. Attending to ecological grief also allowed participants to practice tolerating discomfort that comes with facing scary realities like the climate crisis. And this is a critical capacity for responding to the climate crisis, because if we can't directly look at it, we can't respond because we don't know what we're dealing with. So a really important capacity to cultivate. And lastly, attending to ecological grief programs reminded participants what they care about and reinvigorated a sense of purpose and commitment to continuing to engage with the climate crisis. So just to kind of summarize all of this, I thought I would share this quote by Elizabeth Rush, who is an author who writes about environmental justice. So the only way to survive great loss is by caring for what remains with more heart than before. And when we have support and tools for working through grief, can actually be a really powerful encounter with what matters most to us and what we want to serve. So yeah, thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Hannah again.
Thank you so much, Steph. I want to provide a few toolkits and resources and some things that we can think about as groups and as individuals when we kind of work with our climate grief. So this is going to be based on the work of Madison Cooper, who is recently defended her thesis, and she's one of my lab mates. So thank you to Madison. So one of the first resources I want to highlight is a climate cafe. These specifically kind of like stem from this Climate Psychology Alliance. And these are collective, facilitated, emotion-oriented, and peer-to-peer spaces where people can express their thoughts and feelings about climate change without the need to offer advice or encourage action. They are places to acknowledge the various psychological and emotional reactions to the climate crisis. They're collective in that we're processing these emotions as with others, not as an individual activity. They are facilitated by often a peer or somebody kind of in the same social circle, often not a like formal psychologist or anything like that. And they allow people to really feel these emotions. And the really big key is without offering advice or suggesting action, just feeling these emotions and having a space for that. They have many benefits, including resiliency, validation and support, and community building. Building sustained capacity for empathy through climate cafes is a way that we can really ensure that we are resilient and can continue our climate action. By feeling supported in these emotional experiences, people know that they're not alone. And they build this community and allows people to connect on all emotions related to the climate crisis, including anxiety, including grief, but also including hope, joy, and resilience. This is a quote from one of the interviews that Madison conducted, and this one really sticks with me. The antidote to despair is purpose, not action. Our capacity for action changes. It is always in a state of flux depending on where you are in your life. But if you can build this purposeful connection with the more than human world, if you can make it with your community members who also care, that is a way that you can really ensure that you are building this capacity for resiliency, this capacity for care and love that is really like long-term and sustaining. If you're interested in working on this in your teams or as an individual, I have a few resources I want to highlight here. First is the Emotional Resilience Toolkit from Climate Psychology Alliance North America. Their Northwest Pacific chapter has put together a handbook as well as a specific kind of like set of activities that are facilitated by one person to work through these emotions for people working in climate change. For individuals, the Good Grief Network offers a few different programs that people can engage in by themselves, or you could like sign up with a friend too. And then I'm also going to highlight Refugia again. If you have more questions, definitely come talk to Steph, but this is an opportunity for programs and weekend retreats focused on processing ecological grief. If you're a reader, here are some book recommendations that are some great ones to kind of delve into these climate change emotions. I'll leave that up on the screen. I see a lot of pictures happening, which is awesome. There'll also be some more toolkits at the end after the Q&A, and I believe the slides will be shared out, so they will all be in there. There are lots of resources and places that you can, connect with so that you can process these emotions with your teammates at work. You can work on stuff. You can do activities that allow you to sustain that purpose and those emotional connections. I'm going to pass it over to Steph for a poem to close us off.
I'm gonna stay in my seat this time. Yeah, so we're about to have our Q&A, but yeah, the organization I did my research with, Refugee Retreats, uses a lot of poetry in their programs, so we thought we would finish off with a poem. And this poem reminds me of the duet between grief and love for the world, and that even during the darkest and most despairing moments, the world is still brimming with beauty and wonder, and there's something really humbling about attuning to those small moments of presence and appreciation. So I invite you to take a deep breath, feel your body in your seat. And this is For the Hardest Days by Clint Smith. Some evenings, after days when the world feels like it has poured all of its despair onto me, when I am awash with burdens that rest atop my body like a burlap of jostling shadows, I find a place to watch the sunset. I dig my feet into a soil that has rebirthed itself a million times over. I listen to the sound of leaves as they decide whether or not it is time to descend from their branches. It is hard to describe the comfort one feels in sitting with something you trust will always be there, something you can count on to remain familiar when all else seems awry. How remarkable it is to know that so many have watched the same sunset before you, how the wind can carry pollen and drop it somewhere it has never been, how the leaves have always become the soil and then become the leaves again. How maybe we are not so different than the leaves. How maybe we are also always being reborn to be something more than we once were. How maybe that's what waking up each morning is, a reminder that we are born of the same atoms as every plant and bird and mountain and ocean around us. And I'll pass it over to Kara for our Q&A.
Great presentation, and thank you very much, Steph, for that poem. We purposefully left a lot of time for questions and a couple discussion questions for you, and then Hannah has more resources up on a slide after. Okay, so we'll just start with questions for our panelists. I see there's some popping up here, but we can also take questions from the mics. And then we can ask you a couple questions like takeaways you might have had from this presentation, or if any of those resources were speaking to you. So let's start with our questions. I see we have Jen at the mic. Go ahead, Jen.
I threw mine up there, but I really want you to answer it. So I'm like double attacking you guys with it. I was thinking about when you were presenting ecological grief and you listed a bunch of studies. I was really curious if you've noticed what part of the world those studies are majority being done in, and if you're seeing a gap potentially in where they are coming from. Coming from this, obviously, I'm assuming you're coming from a Western perspective and Western academia. And if you've looked at other knowledge systems and acknowledged those in this research and seen where they and how they process ecological grief. And it's definitely not called that, but it does exist in other knowledge systems. So thinking if you brought that into your research.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, so you raise a number of really good questions. We know that most of the research on mental health and climate change of all kinds, including ecological grief, is from like the Northern, Western, English-speaking world. So there are major disparities around where that research is being resourced and prioritized. So actually Dr. Harper and my other supervisor, Dr. Consulo, work a lot with Northern Indigenous communities in Canada. And Dr. Consulo's work is, I don't know, like canonical when it comes to ecological grief and that focused on the experience of Northern Indigenous people. And yeah, the term ecological grief is new to academia, but these are concepts that humans have been experiencing forever and that are especially pronounced in these communities where connection to land is such a huge part of their way of life, connects people to their long ancestries and personal and community histories. And often those places are also where there's the strongest impacts of climate change. So seeing the permafrost thaw and all of the north is warming far faster than anywhere else in the world. So yeah, I really appreciate that question. My research was focused on people who had participated in this particular in these Alberta programs, and I didn't have any participation from Indigenous people, but that is a really important field of literature. Yeah.
There's.
Oh, there it goes. Okay, wonderful. I just wanted to add to that because actually this field of research was sort of like born from the Arctic, from Inuit in the Arctic. And I think that a lot of climate change, understanding of climate change impacts and also response, we see a lot of leadership from Indigenous communities on that. So just as an example, when we first started doing this research and working with Inuit, they had asked us to explore climate change impacts on health. And healthcare providers in particular were really interested in how they could better support and respond to climate change impacts on health. So we were talking with a lot of different Inuit, including Inuit elders, learning about how climate change was impacting their health. And we were expecting to hear things about sea ice change and how that was leading to injury and death. We were expecting to hear things about water and water quality and how that was changing and leading to things like waterborne disease. And we heard, and heat, of course, too, and how that was impacting health. And we heard all of those things. But what we always heard was how it made people feel and how it was impacting their mental health. And we heard about solastalgia. And this was really the first time in the research community that we were hearing about this. Of course, this was something that had been happening for a very long time and was very well understood by Indigenous people. That includes how people were responding to that. I forget whether it was Steph or Hannah, or maybe both of them had talked about the importance of connecting to nature and the environment. And of course, that's what Inuit were doing in response to this ecological grief and mourning and solastalgia. So all this to say is that I think that this is, like you had very rightly pointed out, this is something that has been long understood by many Indigenous people from around the world, not only how it impacts mental wellness, but also a very good understanding how to effectively respond to some of these things.
Okay, thank you. We have many great questions coming in, and so we'll talk a little bit about the questions related to your research findings, and then there's a lot of questions about what do we do going forward. So one about your findings was just, I had this question too, like you're saying the prairie provinces, like we weren't worried, but yet we had higher anxiety. So can you help us understand like why that or what the difference is?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think that the key take home is that we are worried. Maybe the worry wasn't as high of like a percentage for the prairie provinces as it was for other places in Canada, but it was still very, very high levels of worry and higher than what we've seen in other countries. Climate change anxiety is this sort of like ecological grief. I think that Steph had a really nice slide on that. It's not just one thing. Climate change anxiety is like a scale, and it has many different things that come into it. It's like 13 different emotions like coming in together. So it's how that constellation of emotions is climate change anxiety, not just one question on anxiety, like do you feel anxious? It's like 13 different things and how they come together. So yeah, I guess to answer that, worry was really high, but climate change anxiety is not just about worry, it's about a lot of different things and how they come together.
Okay, yeah, thanks for explaining that it's a constellation of emotions and that helps us. So we really are anxious and worried in the prairies as well about this. So did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so my question around, and I didn't see this in your survey breakdown, but I was just wondering, how do disasters or natural disasters or the climate emergency, how, from your research, did that impact those who have pre-existing conditions like PTSD or anxiety? And then my secondary question is, I think we all understand that mental health is very, it's underfunded in Canada, and even amongst benefits is underfunded. So I'm just wondering how you'll generalize your findings and how you plan on sharing this with the public, because I think it's really important.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So there's some other research, like after a specific disaster, like Hannah had presented, they take into consideration like pre-existing mental health conditions. And we know that people who have pre-existing mental health conditions are more likely to experience things like climate change, anxiety, and others. There's an association there that has been shown in other places around the world and in other work. In our survey, it's really hard to get people to fill out a survey these days, as you can probably all relate to. So we had to keep our survey really short. And if we were to try and like also have a sense if somebody has like clinical depression or clinical anxiety or these other things, it was just not feasible for us. So we didn't look at that. But we know what the baseline levels of those different mental health experiences are in Canada. And we know that what we saw in the survey was much higher. And this was not like a convenient sample of just people who were interested in this topic or something like that, or people who work on climate change and are thinking about it all the time. This survey was representative of Canadians. So we can say with pretty high confidence from a science perspective that most Canadians are feeling this way. So yeah, I think that that's a pretty astounding finding. And then just to build on what Kara was saying, I think that the one thing that stands out to me as somebody from Ontario who moved here 6 years ago, there's often this outside perception that Albertans or people in the prairie provinces don't care about climate change, or that they don't think climate change is real or something like that. Well, these results clearly show that people here care about this, and they care about it deeply, and it's impacting them deeply. So I think it also dispels that. In terms of resources moving forward, the whole reason we did this survey is because decision makers kept on asking us, yeah, that qualitative study is really nice, or that quantitative study after one specific event, yes, we see that climate change is impacting mental health, but is it really that big of a deal? And are most Canadians really impacted by it? We don't really think so. Well, our survey shows that that's not the case. So we're hoping that this can help mobilize, support, justify, provide rationale for investing in these types of resources. Yeah, time will tell.
Thank you. And there's a few other more detailed questions about your survey and how statistically significant it was and the response rate and stuff. So we'll get you to answer those afterwards, because there's also a theme kind of about like, yes, in our Alberta and Saskatchewan, Manitoba, we do feel it. Some people here are saying, I don't necessarily feel comfortable talking about it at work. And so it's good we're having this kind of safe space. You gave us some tips for what to do, getting out in nature and creating these kind of conversations. So I think those kind of like going forward actions are going to be what we want to take away. I know Hannah had some resources that she was gonna suggest in addition to the list you saw, and then we were going to ask you to reflect and share kind of what you took away from this presentation, or what some of those resources you might be able to apply in your own work. So we'll just review a few more of the resources for you. Did you want to do that?
Yes, I can definitely do that. I do also want to say, because I see a lot of questions coming in around like, I don't feel comfortable talking about this at work. And I think that is a very, as with all mental health things, it is stigmatized. There are barriers to that in that way. And so I think as why I wanted to provide some like individual resources. You can go find people who are like-minded. Climate cafes, that's a really excellent one as well. I saw somebody like really plugging the Good Grief Network. So those kinds of things. But in these resources I'll provide, there are like very formalized, like you can do this for 10 to 15 minutes. Here are the questions, like a very much like a workshop style that might be a little bit easier to broach to a supervisor. Like, hey, I learned about this at a conference. Could we maybe do this as a team? Here's the exact way we do it. Here's the facilitator notes. And then maybe that's a way that you can get that conversation started in your workplace so that it's not feeling like, when you're having a day where you're like, all I've read today is horrible, terrible, very bad news. Maybe then because you had that discussion a few weeks ago, be like, guys, I'm feeling really blank, and open that conversation will be easier. So maybe that would be the advice I provide.
Great. And then we'll get you to talk some more about the resources. And so in future focus, thinking ahead, there's a question about like legislating mental health supports for climate change workers, or have you heard anything about like the emerging field of supporting folks like us working in climate change because of what we deal with every day?
I can kick us off, and then I'd love to turn it over to you guys because I know you've been actively reading and doing sessions on this as well. I'll put my IPCC hat on. And one example that we drew a lot from in our latest assessment on impacts and adaptation was from Australia, from the bushfires there. The government had provided additional mental health resources during that disaster. So for example, they opened up like a telehealth line that was specifically dedicated to mental health services. They extended the hours of operation, and they also provided specific programs and resources that were targeted at youth. And we know that had a positive impact on mental health during the bushfire. So we know that providing these types of resources can have a positive impact. We've seen similar research all around the world that show similar trends, including places like China and Southeast Asia. We know that providing these resources has a measurable impact on positive mental health. And I was going to make one more comment, but I don't remember. So I'll turn it over to you guys.
Did you want to add to that?
I can definitely add from the perspective of how do we address this kind of in community. So I think, and are some questions as well, like how do we do this in a workspace? And I think that there are some really amazing resources, toolkits, facilitated workshops that have to be included. So if you are in a supervisory capacity in any way, maybe that's what you are taking, and you're going to really fight to have that in your organization. Make sure it's being included. We have to see this in the, in bureaucratic systems. Somebody who's a little bit higher up is going to have to suggest this. So bringing that back is going to be really important. As well, kind of taking a page out of the trauma-informed handbook of education and community connectedness is really important as well. We can have spaces that are there are ways that we can make spaces more safe from this literature on being trauma informed by allowing people to express these emotions, experience them in a way where we are open to hearing about it, where we let them express this and don't always try to provide solutions. I think we've heard that, especially from Lily's presentation. I was so impressed. And you talked about how young people really do feel like sometimes all you're doing is offering me suggestions, not hearing me out on this. And so that can be a really important tool. I will definitely direct to I can definitely also put together some trauma-informed resources too. There's lots of great trainings on that. So I hope that maybe helps from the more educational side of things. When we go into schools, giving even just a chance to talk about the emotional impacts of learning about this is really important. Offering a space for questions, a space for reflection. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything, Steph?
Yeah, sure. I feel like I had a bunch of thoughts as everyone was talking, but I don't know how many of them I'll regather. But yeah, I think one thing that was really interesting to me in my research was, when I was talking to people about their experience with the emotional impacts of the climate crisis, actually one of the main themes that came up was all of the ways that the climate crisis makes them feel lonely. And one of them was being emotionally impacted and being concerned and feeling like there's no space to talk about that. They're worried about being a downer, about killing the mood, that other people are uncomfortable. And that was like a very powerful aspect of what they were grieving and carrying. So yeah, creating more spaces for where we can normalize those conversations. Also, we already know that most people in Canada are feeling these things. We expect these numbers to grow as warming continues. And that makes now like a critical time to be investing in infrastructure for supporting and connecting over those emotional impacts.
Thank you. And the question you just had up was really good. And it was around, you know, how do I start this conversation with people that don't necessarily aren't thinking about climate change and mental health? Like we're all thinking about it, people online are thinking about it, but then we have to go back to these big organizations or governments and try and explain it to people that aren't dealing with it every day. So I find even just like saying the word mental health, people are like, oh, I don't need to really talk about that. That's not my department, or, but then if you start to go there and they think, why are those climate people talking about mental health? They're like, okay, that's because it is impacting them. And that's one way to get them thinking about it. But is there any kind of tips about kind of raising the issue with others?
I'm sure you guys have some great suggestions too. And so I'll start us off and turn it over to you. I feel like it's making it personal really helps on any discussion related to climate change, and including this one. So for example, I have 2 young kids at home, and I can tell you that last summer, as Steph had shared in her own research, it was really hard for our household not to be able to get outside. They were cooped up, then we had a really long winter. And then it was finally getting nice enough this spring to like go outside, and I was going to walk them home from daycare for the first time of the year outside instead of driving because of the cold. I opened the door and I could smell wildfire smoke, and I was just like, oh my gosh, you've got to be kidding me. And that like emotional impact of that was really heavy. And I wasn't the only one experiencing that. I know other people were too. Another example, when people are talking about different climate change related things, linking it to mental health can be important. So I'll give you another personal example from my household. Last summer, so we heard from Heather about this heat wave that happened in Alberta last year around the same time. Like we're having all these heat waves. We're also having air quality issues with wildfire smoke. So in our household, we're faced with the decision between do we open the windows at night to let cold air in for our kids to keep like the temperature regulated, to keep them safe that way. But if we open the windows, then the wildfire smoke comes in and it's bad for their lung health. And so you're making these really challenging climate change related decisions on a day-to-day basis. Those are health decisions as an example. But the mental health weight of those decisions weighs on me heavily. And so when talking about things like wildfire smoke or those like day-to-day decisions that we're making related to climate change, maybe we're not calling them climate change and we should, and maybe we're not linking it to the mental health or emotional wellness impacts that has, but we should, because if I started talking about it that way, then it normalizes it and it opens that door to that discussion.
Yeah, I'm not, yeah. The one thing that's coming to mind is just if you're thinking about bringing these conversations into a workplace, some of the resources we have up, including refugee retreats, which I did my research with, they do have like PD sessions that sometimes that's like a nice way. Sometimes the problem is nobody feels like they know how to open the conversation. So even getting some external help with that, and that can maybe plant some seeds for future conversations. I'll also say that these conversations, if you're trying to engage a group, like a workplace, it helps to have some structures. Like it's not something that will necessarily just flow if nobody's really like giving a container, facilitating. So yeah, even just putting a little bit of thought into like some prompts, or like an exercise I've done a million times is like people bring something that symbolizes something they love about the world or their work, and something that is difficult about their world or their work, and just giving people a little bit of like stuff to interact with, because there is kind of a stigma around these conversations. Having some structure when you're trying to bring it into the workplace can be really helpful.
All right, thank you. So some great tips for all of us then. So, if you want to start a conversation at work, you can use a prompt, question. You can bring something that's meaningful. We did a test run in Leduc, and we had to bring a photo of places we hold near and dear. That was based on some of our work we did with railroads, and that worked to really start a great conversation. So, and then Shirley, you're saying we have to be brave and we have to speak up a little bit and we can personalize it. So don't be shy to share your personal story, because your colleagues aren't going to dismiss you if you're sharing your personal story. And then your other point was link it to mental health. So you can say that decision for me was challenging. Thank you all. And we're going to get to the resources and we're put them up. Did you have a slide for it?
Yes.
Yeah, go for it. And then we're going to let you answer the discussion questions on Menti over lunch so that we don't hold you up from all that great food at the back. So go ahead and put the resources up, and then you'll be able to enter into the Mentimeter if there's any takeaways you had or any of the resources that you appreciate and you're going to take back to your organization. So go ahead, Hannah.
Awesome. So there's gonna be two slides that are gonna come up. One is general mental health resources, things that you can supply to yourself, people that you care about if you are experiencing mental health, any sort of like crisis or anything that you want to seek out more like personalized mental health care. And then the other slide is going to bring up a lot of these toolkits and resources. Some of them I talked about, some of them I didn't have a chance to, but these are all amazing organizations doing really great work. I also want to plug, just in relation to our last question, talking about how to talk to people about climate change, Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, she's the author of the book, one of the Saving Us Climate Scientists' Case for Hope in a Divided World. She is the scientist behind that one. On the book side, and that one, she's a really great resource for how to talk to people about climate change. So these are any general mental health resources if you do, and I'll just open that. And then these are the climate change and mental health ones. So I talked about Good Grief Network as well as Climate Psychology Alliance. I will highlight the North American one has a climate aware therapist directory, as there are, it can be challenging to talk to a therapist who is not on the same page as you about climate change necessarily. So these are people who would be. Mental Health and Climate Change Alliance has some really great resources, personal and professional. And then UBC Climate Wellbeing Hub, again, has a lot of these toolkits, resources, like pre-prepared for you to do a session on this. And I think those are really great. There's a lot of different options, so you definitely would want to look into that. But also, as Steph said, bringing in somebody professional might be a really great thing too. Yeah, and I'll just leave those up for you. Thank you so much, everyone, for your awesome participation in the session. And I am so glad to have been presenting today.
Thank you to all our panelists.